Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've got updates on the Venezuelan situation with Donald Trump now coming out and hosting another press conference, a roundtable with a lot of the cabinet, and is saying, yeah, there potentially will be mainland strikes onto Venezuela. There could be escalation. They've been trying to tempt Venezuela with different tactics. They've been blowing up some of these drug boats. Some liberals and people saying, well, are they within their rights to do this? Rubio has said, well, it's international water. We know what they are. They're not here to fish. And yeah, I mean, they're coming to the United States. They've got a bunch of drugs. It's a big issue. So the United States, I think they're trying to help kind of foster Venezuela to possibly do something in the United States. It gives the U.S. a reason to strike back, and they really want regime change. They want this socialist regime with Nicolas Maduro out of Venezuela, and they want a pro-democracy, U.S. favorable regime. There's major sanctions right now against Venezuela. The corruption is terrible. They've got massive oil reserves. They got more oil reserves than Saudi Arabia, and the United States and the West wants access to it. Would likely bring down the price of oil, at least temporarily, and it would allow the United States to build a real infrastructure and have more access to Latin American oil, which would also diversify the oil that we receive, and we don't have to rely so much on the instability within the Middle Eastern countries. So it would be ideal, but this is one of those, is it really worth it for the administration and for Donald Trump? We know Trump brags about ending 8 or 9 wars, whether or not people want to give him credit for all of those. Certainly, at least right now, we've got the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. We have possibly, Israel-Iran, although you could say, well, Trump also created that war partially, but, that was a 2-day thing where the United States was barely involved. And then they say, well, it's going to kick up again. Well, we'll see. And then you still have the war in Eastern Europe going on, and we'll see if that ends. But, you can see what Trump says here. Trump says there will be land action in Venezuela soon, saying, we're going to see on the ground action, whatever that means. My guess is probably some type of inland strikes within some of their drug cartels, maybe to try and create some division within Venezuela and force regime change. A lot of Venezuelans do not like the current regime. They blatantly cheated in their last election to remain in power. And right now, the Trump administration holds a view that is they want the current regime out, no questions asked, and they want easier trade when it comes to the oil reserves. There's so much corruption, this just completely out of date, and Venezuela would be a lot better if they got a new regime. But again, this is one of those things to where, is it really worth it for Trump to meddle in Venezuela when he ran a campaign that was really focused on domestic issues within the United States? This is creating a new problem. Now, Venezuela has been a problem for a while, but this is escalating it. And it seems like Trump is now shooting at some of positioning his strategic warships and shooting at some of these drug boats as a way to try and entice Venezuela into a response which potentially would enable the United States to really escalate in a way that would be some type of tactic that maybe will help enable some of the Venezuelans resisting. Remember, the person that won the Nobel Peace Prize is a pro-democratic Venezuelan resistor. And so this is something that's been going on there for a while, and the socialist government did blatantly cheat in the last election. That's the only reason they're in. And so that's what Trump is really saying is justification for this. But look, whether or not this happens, this is one of those things to where I'm not sure from a normie perspective it's going to have a ton of backing, just because it doesn't look great if you're Trump and you run on the mantra of no new wars. Yes, it's more complicated than that. We know it, but this looks like Trump is escalating a situation to create another war. What does a war in Venezuela really mean? Well, it's very limited military action by the United States. It's just trying to kickstart some type of resistance campaign by the pro-democratic side within Venezuela. And if the United States can get a different regime in Venezuela that's more pro-US and less pro-Eastern countries, it'd be very favorable. But again, this is kind of like, is it really worth it? How long does this last? This is going to be used against Trump almost immediately if there is more escalation by the United States, because we're not going to know if this really turns out for another several months at least, possibly longer than that, because there would be potentially a lot of infighting within Venezuela, not just between the United States and the Venezuelan army, but between Venezuela, the resistance, and the current administration. And the hope is that the resistance would win, and that would be a some type of regime change for the United States, where we could have a lot easier access to the massive oil reserves, which would give us more diversification, and you wouldn't have to rely on the Middle East as much, because they do have the most oil reserves in the world. But right now it is poorly mismanaged because of their socialist regime, the corruption, the incompetency, and all of that. So that's just the current update. Again, I would say when it comes to the cartel situation, I'm guessing there's a lot more of an appetite from the American citizens to really be aggressive against the Mexican cartels, because we share a border with them, and that's considered. Hey, by the way, I heard a story about Mexico with the immigrants pouring in, because normally they're like the feeder country. The immigrants would come through Mexico and then sneak across the border. Well, because Trump has completely shut off the border, the immigrants coming in from other nations into Mexico, the government is just turning them back and saying, go back to Venezuela, go back to Africa, go back to wherever you came from, because you're not going to get through. So they're getting turned back now in Mexico, a lot of the people trying to come over as illegal immigrants, because of how shut down the border is. But in terms of a campaign against drug cartels, there would be a lot more justification, you would figure, for some type of targeted campaign within Mexico against the Mexican drug cartels, as Mexico is completely overrun by the cartels, and the cartels have infiltrated the government, and they've got terrible corruption. And the United States and Mexico, obviously the proximity makes it more justified than a Latin American country set more south like Venezuela. Although, because of the oil reserves that Venezuela has, because of the cushy relationship they have with some of our adversaries, you could say, well, this potentially could work out for the United States, but we've seen this in other countries, this story before, where the United States tends to get bogged down and it's a waste of money. And even if a regime change happens, it doesn't happen the way the United States wants it to. And this is something it's extremely challenging to argue in the moment if there is some type of escalation, because how do you really argue it? Trump has ran on not starting anything, and he's starting something, and it's one of those things to where, well, maybe it'll work out for the United States if there is some type of regime change and we have better access to those reserves. We can say that right now, but that would be something that took months and months and maybe even years down the line for that to come to fruition. So I think there has to be some type of excuse for the United States to escalate further. It would be Venezuela doing something to provoke the United States into some type of escalation. Let's see what Trump says here.
Mr. President.
Yeah, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. Good to see you. If I could just ask both of you, including Secretary Hegseth, there's reporting the U.S. just sent B-1 bombers near Venezuela to ramp up some military pressure there. Is that accurate? And can you tell us more about that mission?
No, it's not accurate. No, it's false. But we're not happy with Venezuela for a lot of reasons.
Well, why would Trump admit that? It doesn't make any sense. The reality is, he says they're not happy with Venezuela. Trump knows something's gonna happen with Venezuela as escalation continues. You can tell the way the language that he's using. Trump will see land action in Venezuela soon. What does that mean? The resistance within Venezuela against the regime, the current regime? Or is there going to be U.S. involvement in terms of strikes, maybe targeted strikes against cartel operations, things of that nature, maybe targeted operations against the cartels within Venezuela, more aggression? I could see something like that. And they've got this terrible drug situation. You use that kind of as a guise because you want the regime out, so you got easier access to the oil reserves, and you've got a pro-West Venezuela. that's the idea. Now we'll see. I mean, again, this is it's a complicated thing. It doesn't happen in 2 days, so that's the issue. And if he does decide to do this, and we've seen other regime changes, albeit from areas that are much further away than where Venezuela is located, other regime change attempts by the United States not go well. That's a lot of Middle Eastern activity. It's also Vietnam, but I would say we'll see what happens with Venezuela. People are not going to be too happy if Trump ends up doing this, just because if you go by what's been happening, I mean, it is escalation. It is, I mean, you want to call it a war. It's hard to really even know, honestly. Like, what is the United States going to use in terms of assets from their military for something like this? It's going to be very minute. So I don't really see this. They try to drum up the whole Israel-Iran thing and make it this. People still say it's this terrible war. It was a 12-day war. The United States was involved for 2 days, and there was zero U.S. troop involvement that resulted in any type of injury or casualty for the U.S. troops. So, we can label it whatever we want. There's gonna be a lot of people labeling it a war, but it might be an inner like a civil war within Venezuela. And we might provoke it a little bit, but we're really not fighting in it. That's what I would say. Maybe there's some targeted strikes that provoke the tensions within Venezuela to rise. And then if there were something that happened in terms of a regime change, the United States could take advantage of it, and Trump could say, well, that's a major win for him, but that's the problem, is it would take likely a long time for that to happen. So you're really pushing, especially with the midterms upcoming in a year, if you try to provoke, which it seems like they are, because originally I was not taking this seriously, and then Trump comes out and says this today. Well, there's a reason they've been in those waters and they've been sinking the drug boats. There's a reason they're doing it. They're not doing it just because they want to show, some type of force for the American people. It's more so for the Venezuelans. That's the reason they're doing this, and they're trying to provoke something within Venezuela to possibly force some type of regime change. And Trump has talked about that, and we'll have to see if it ends up happening or not. But that's basically the gist of it. And now Trump is saying, well, there's going to be land action. Maybe there's targeted strikes against some of the cartel compounds. And again, if you're going to do targeted strikes against cartels in foreign countries, it'd be a lot more, people would understand it a lot better if he did it in Mexico, because of the proximity to the United States, because people are more familiar with the Mexican cartels, because people view the Mexican cartels as a much bigger threat to Americans than the Venezuelan drug situation. But because of the oil reserves, Trump obviously is eyeing Venezuela and possibly looking to disrupt that current Maduro regime into some type of change that would be more pro-West, more pro-United States, and possibly allow the sanctions to be lifted off Venezuela, which would help upgrade their infrastructure and really kickstart the oil production and their oil reserves. And we could see a significant shift to where we're buying a lot of Venezuelan oil, and we're also diversifying the oil that we buy. But it's one of those things to where, again, you're talking about this happening down the line. If you run on no new wars and then you're provoking something in Venezuela, which is exactly what they're doing. I mean, let's just be honest. They've got like warships parked right on international waters outside. They're clearly trying to stir something up within the country, and maybe it's the resistance against the regime, and that's possibly what Trump wants, rather than direct U.S. involvement, because you can still try and have plausible deniability and say, well, it's not us, it's the country itself fighting itself, and maybe it's something like that. But they're saying, well, there has to be some type, you have to provoke it or do something, because otherwise it's not going to happen. There's not going to be a regime change. Trump wants this to happen, it looks like. So we'll see. And maybe this is just something they toy with, and they see how the Venezuelans react over certain strikes. And maybe it ends up not being worth it, and they don't go forward with it. I don't know what's going to happen, but it does seem like there's some type of escalation within Venezuela that's been going on now for over a month, really 2 months, and this potentially could come to a head at some point if the escalation continues with the United States. Instead of sinking a bunch of these drug boats in international waters, would the United States go a step forward and target some of the cartel compounds? Or are they waiting for some type of Venezuelan response to try and give themselves justification to do it, at least justification to the American people? you have to wonder about that as well. Is that why there's this delay to where they're sinking 1 or 2 drug boats every few weeks? Here and there, they're releasing all the video of it. You've got Hegseth talking about it, bragging about it. But really, what's the next step? Because they're clearly trying to force some type of action within Venezuela, and at least for the last month or two since they've started this campaign, it hasn't happened. So is there going to have to be more of an escalation to force some type of action within Venezuela? Well, that might be what ends up happening. I mean, you've got Trump saying he's not happy with Venezuela. They want that regime out. That's been known. And we will have to see. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video. Make sure you like the video down below. Also follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.